In a world with artificial intelligence, how do we transform education? Thanks for tuning in. I'm Daniel Lopez, and this is the AI Education Conversation, where we explore the opportunities, risks, and impacts of AI across education. If you'd like to join the conversation, check out the AIeducationconversation.com. Let's jump in. Hey everyone, I hope the week is treating you well. This upcoming week is going to be a really eventful week for AI exploration and literacy, and I hope you have some time to dive into all the fun conferences taking place this week. So, in the spirit of this, I'm actually going to be dropping this episode 2 days earlier than normal so that you have time to dive into those conferences on Thursday. I have the privilege of presenting at two conferences, both on that Thursday, February 29th, and I would love to see you in my sessions. First, if you haven't already, Evergreen AI is leading the SequoiaCon conference on Thursday and Friday. There will be multiple sessions taking place on both days and so many topics you can dive into. I personally will be presenting on Thursday, and my session is titled From Chalkboards to Chatbots Strategies for AI Implementation and Change Management Across Your School Community. Really, my focus here is going to be on highlighting lessons from my experiences working in 5+ school districts, over 60+ high schools, and across 2 states. I'm also going to be highlighting key lessons from our speakers in previous episodes. If you're interested in checking out my session, plus the 60+ other sessions over those 2 days, you can register in the link here in the episode description or in the show notes. If you use code AI Convo, you'll get $50 off. Secondly, I'm also going to have the opportunity to be presenting at day 29. We learned a little bit more about that experience by our friend Dr. Neka McGee in last episode. My session here is going to be titled Unleash Your Inner AI Artist Using AI Image Generation for Engagement and J Factor in Education. I think it'll make your next team builder, your next assessment, or your next PowerPoint so much more fun and interesting. And I'm really excited to talk about what I've learned in all of my experiences creating AI generated images and sharing fun use cases there. I may also be guest appearing on a panel during the day, also. Stay tuned on that. We'll see what happens there. I will also include the link for the day 29 registration in the episode notes alongside that SequoiaCon conference so that you can register and engage in any of the sessions that you might have. So hold some time on Thursday, get yourself into some good quality AI professional development. That being said, as an energizing primer for the deep learning days coming up on Thursday here, I'm really excited to bring you my conversation with the Chief Executive Officer of InnovateEDU, Erin Mote. Erin is an AI education thought leader informing policy on a national level with her work in AI policy and implementation with partners like NYC Public Schools and the White House, and through the work of the EDSAFE AI Alliance. Alongside her work with InnovateEDU, Erin spent a decade founding and leading Brooklyn Laboratory Charter Schools. She shares a really compelling story during our conversation, and beyond the compelling conversation that we had around data privacy, implementation, NY City Public Schools, and her vision for AI in education, that story that she shared about her decision to form Brooklyn Labs was really one memorable takeaway for me. Erin's decision to step away from her work in national security to found a school really left some key learnings I think for me there. I hope that as you listen to her story and experience it like I did, it serves as a really helpful reminder that we sometimes have to make the uncomfortable short-term choice to pursue our long-term purpose and our passions. If you're interested in my other takeaways, as always, check out the companion show notes in this episode description or sign up for the conversation at the AIeducationconversation.com. I share all show notes with my community 12 hours before sharing with my social media networks. If you have any other thoughts on today's episode, you can join the conversation at the AIeducation.com or message me on LinkedIn. Humans at the heart of education. I'll see you on Thursday, and I hope you enjoy this episode. Erin Mote, welcome to the AI Education Conversation.
Thanks for having me. So excited to chat with you, Daniel.
Oh, I know we were already having a really good conversation off air here even before we hit record, so we couldn't hit the button fast enough. So I'm eager to dig in here. Now it feels like you and your work has been all over my timeline, so I'd love to just bring people in a little bit to some of the work that you were doing. So before we really get to Innovate EDU, can you just share a little bit more about your background, your professional journey, and how'd you get there?
Yeah, so I'm an enterprise architect by training. So the advantage of that is that I can only think in systems. And that's really the through line of my career. I worked in public service and national security before I made the jump into education. People are always like, "Whoa, that's a pivot." But for me, I believe right now education is our greatest national security crisis, and how we are thinking about equity in our schools, how we're thinking about the pathways for our young people, how we're supporting and addressing the working conditions of teachers. These are all things that will, I think, determine the future of this country and our national competitiveness and therefore our national security. So, after working in federal government, I worked in the private sector for a little bit, and then I felt really distant from impact. And so I was walking down the street with my now husband. He wasn't my husband then, telling him I was going to return back to Washington, D.C. in public service. And he did not love that. He said, but I want to get married and have kids. It was a really sloppy marriage proposal, but obviously it worked. And so he said we could found a school in our own neighborhood and do the type of work that you've always wanted to do. And so I sort of was like, are you crazy? I might have used other words than that, but it stuck with me. And then we plotted it out on a napkin, what we would want a school to look like, things like teachers trained like doctors, students in charge of their own learning, personalized learning, a place that kids who didn't traditionally have access to college opportunity would gain that access, a school for those who aren't well served by other educational institutions. And so more than 10 years ago, we founded Brooklyn Lab Charter School. It's now a comprehensive 612. Some of our babies have already, in that first class, have already graduated college. Some are graduating this year. And while I'm not involved in the school on a day-to-day basis anymore, it was the incubation of InnovateEDU, which is the nonprofit we founded alongside of Brooklyn Lab to scale the innovation that would happen at Brooklyn Lab to other schools and partners. And so from that journey of building a school and building a nonprofit, we've done that. And now the organization Innovate EDU has really grown to be a national thought leader that builds uncommon alliances to move big challenges and sector-wide problems in education, from data interoperability to remaking the coalition he's working with students with disabilities, to the one I think we're going to talk about today, which is the EDSAFE AI Alliance, which is all about the safe, accountable, fair, transparent, and efficacious use of AI in education. And so that's a bit of the journey. There's a lot of other things in between, including two small kids, 5 and 8 now, Robert and Claire, and a lot of amazing educators, students, partners, co-conspirers that I've learned from along the way that have just made me more passionate about what we need to do in education more than 10 years later than I was when I started Innovate EDU and Brooklyn Lab.
That's fascinating. I mean, I had no idea that the journey of Innovate EDU was connected to the Brooklyn Labs when I was looking at your profile. I heard you say that you part of the reason you did that was for scaling. Can you? I'd be curious to hear a little bit more about that. Can you talk a little bit about the rationale with feeling like, okay, there needs to be, was it about sharing some of the lessons that you were gaining from the Brooklyn Lab and wanting to share that in a different way, or what why were those things created in tandem?
Yeah, well, I tell it like it is. That's sort of my reputation. So I'll name that, like, originally we weren't going to create a nonprofit side by side with the school, but we were in a windowless conference room in San Francisco, and this was 2012, 2013. So the Bloomberg era in New York was ending. De Blasio was coming in. There was starting to be a lot of politics around charters and public school
Mm.
and, New York City DOE schools and whether they could work together and what was happening there. And so we got some really good advice that if we did the innovation work at the charter school, it might limit our ability to actually do the thing that charter schools were originally envisioned to be, which were laboratories for innovation that could then scale into a more traditional system. That's why we named it Brooklyn Lab, because we really did think of it as a laboratory of innovation for new models around talent, new models around tech, new models around supporting students with disabilities. And so we created the nonprofit so that it would be easier to get those innovations, those lessons learned out of the school and allow for partnerships to happen. And so it was really great advice. It was probably some of the best advice that we got in the founding of the school because it helped us see around the corner, not just to the political reality that was happening, but also what some of the places would be that we could actually build capacity for coalition building, build capacity for capacity building of other organizations. And you couldn't really do that at a school. And so it really allowed us to do some things that I think, on the talent space were revolutionary 10 years ago. We had a fellowship program where we took folks who were just out of college graduates or were career changers, put them in a year-long fellowship program where they got student loan forgiveness, but also got experience leading small group tutoring. So 10 years ago, we were doing 5-person high dosage tutoring. Every kid in the school gets 2 hours basically of tutoring, 1 hour in math, one in reading every single day with a different core group of educators than their classroom teacher. And so that is like the thing that 80% of school districts are doing right now in COVID
Hmm.
recovery. And so, and is actually a lot of the origin of the model of the National Partnership for Student Success, another alliance that EnnovateEDU is part of. That's the big initiative of the Biden Harris administration to add 250,000 more tutors, mentors, post-secondary transition coaches, student success coaches to America's classrooms. And so we wouldn't have been able to do that without the nonprofit that could sort of serve as the employer of these tutors, could create these pathways for them actually into teaching. And so then these lab corps members became a functionally like apprentice teachers at Brooklyn Lab. So they would leave the fellowship and then go into a 2-year residency and then become full teachers of record. And so a lot
Yeah.
of that laboratory feedback loop proving that it could work, doing the research and evidence building at an actual school is what that dynamic partnership between EnnovateEDU and Brooklyn Lab allowed. And the school continues to thrive now under great leadership, and I get to be in touch and sort of wave at homecoming and graduation and get grad invites from our kids. And it's been a real journey and a joy to watch a school in my own community come up and thrive and serve kids from all backgrounds.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that voiceover. I think, even to your point there in the early 2000s, obviously there was such a need and an appetite for thought leadership in spaces to, break out of our silos and collaborating. And I would obviously that is only increased in the world we're in now with some of the areas that you're doing that, which we'll talk a little bit more about. But I will say that beyond that, I'd love to ground our conversation in something else that really stood out to me about your website because most of the time when I'm going on nonprofit, I mean, I work for a nonprofit. We don't have a manifesto on our website. That's not, I would say, something that I'm normally finding. But I read your perspective, and I was like snaps, right? I totally agree with this. I this resonates, and so I'd love to just like ground our conversation in that because I think once folks understand, your manifesto, your vision for EnnovateEDU, then it becomes very clear to see like so many ways later that that's being embodied in the work that you all are producing. So I'd love to just start there. What is the common 80%, and
Yeah.
what does that mean, and how does it show up in your work?
Yeah. Well, people always are like a manifesto, and I'm like, yeah, because it is the ethos of what we believe and how we act and what grounds everything we do at EnnovateEDU. It is the heart of our core values. And it's this belief that we have far more in common than we do different. And that if we can think about the things that actually bind us together across political divisions, across organizational divisions, across the traditional silos that exist in education, we can move further faster when we do it together. And so it's this idea of a common architecture is goes all the way back to the origin story of my professional career as an enterprise architect. So in enterprise architecture, you build something that's called the common tech stack. It's sort of the thing that everybody else builds off of. And so you experience this probably, and your listeners do right now as consumers, in some of the really common apps and tech platforms you use. So maybe your listeners use Uber and Lyft, and they use them for different reasons. Some folks really like the Lyft app because of the feel it gives them, the way that, they have lots of options. They can ride with other folks. They has a different brand connotation. Some folks like Uber because, it allows them to have a black car service, or it allows them to choose different levels of service, or it's a more corporate feel versus a Lyft. And so, but the thing that maybe your listeners don't know is on the back end of those platforms, about 80% of their architecture, their technology stack is common. They use the same
Mhm.
platform for payments. They use the same platform for maps. They use the same platform for when you might have an issue, actually. Like, all that is the same technology. This, and in some cases the very same applications. But the experience, right? The 20% that you see is different, but the 80% on the back end is common. And so, what if we thought about an infrastructure in education that really started from common ground and said, how do we find the 80% common? How do we move from a system that is about schooling to a system that is about learning? And that doesn't say that your context isn't important, that 20% that makes it unique isn't important, but actually you can start somewhere to begin with. You can have starter dough. And so we really work at EDU to build tables and sometimes to break tables that bring folks together to find common ground. You might not think that, oh, AFT and NEA can sit at the same table on education AI as the National Council for Learning Disabilities, or the New Teacher Project, or an Opportunity Labs, which is thinking about mental health issues and in education. And so, how do we help folks find common ground, build trust, and begin to work together and row in the same direction? And we've been doing that at EDU, whether that's on data interoperability with Project Unicorn, which when we started, nobody knew what data interoperability is. Now, the first lady is saying the word data interoperability and cybersecurity from the East Room of the White House. And that happens because people are rowing together, people are finding what's common, and people are building a movement to really think about how do we better support young people and build this learning system. So that's a little
Yeah.
bit about the manifesto. I'm not going to use the word militant, but I think it's really important to always look for what do we share, and really, I think that's really important right now in our country, maybe more than ever, in our schools and in our communities, to think about what makes us human, whether that's knowledge or fear, whether that's, you know, the things that we believe we can do together, or maybe the things we don't believe we can do. And I think that's another really important part of the EDU manifesto, is we say the things that we don't think we can agree on.
Yeah. No, I mean that resonates so much, and I would just say when I had the opportunity to read it, the initial thing I just kept thinking about is that so much of my work has been similar in the sense that we have in so many places played the role of conveners between schools and between institutions, and one of the biggest things I've learned from that is like the reality is for a lot of public schools in particular in the United States today, that can be such an isolating experience,
Oof.
and that sucks when you are a school counselor, you're a teacher, you're a school leader who is like dedicating your life to public service, doing the hard work of supporting and empowering our young people, trying to take on what can feel like insurmountable obstacles on a daily basis, and to compound that to feel like you're doing it alone. I mean, that's just probably like the worst feeling that you could possibly have. I mean, as someone again who has felt that, and as I worked in schools, I know that it's a really dark place, but there can be such a different experience, such a different mindset that you're approaching the work with when you just are in environments where you're connected with other people doing similar work, and you just feel like you're not alone. You feel like, no, like this work's really hard. It is tough, and we have a lot of big things we have to figure out. But look at all these people in the room who care and are trying to figure out and row the same way as you described that I am, and that can create such a different experience. And then I think to your other point, the fact that especially in the United States today, so much of our civil discourse, so much of like what our young people are seeing is us being in silos on social media. For
Mm,
us to be like able to model that in such a big way and say like, yeah, on the football field we're rivals with this high school, but you know what? All the teachers are friends. We actually collaborate together. We work because we all want to help our students, even if we have this friendly sports rivalry or whatever it is, and just being able to do that. And so I just, that's what I had been thinking so much about
mm.
when I was reading this manifesto that you
Well,
had on
that's
there.
lovely. I mean, I think you're right. I think that leadership is lonely.
Mhm.
And whether you're a classroom teacher or whether you're a principal or whether you're a state chief, like we have to give voice to that loneliness, and we have to give voice to the idea that actually you're not alone. There's a whole group of people who are willing to rally with you and come together and support you. And I think, I also think we're at a time in this country where our young people feel really alone. They
Oh yeah.
feel really socially isolated from each other and maybe even from the institution of school. And we gotta reconnect with each other. We gotta sort of establish those ties that actually make it possible for us to do big things. Because I believe our young people are capable of doing big things, and I believe the education sector is capable of doing big things.
Yeah. One way that you all have embodied this work is through the work of AI. And I'm curious to just hear a little bit more about the EdSafe AI Alliance, what that is, the work that you all do, and really how did it get started? Have you all been exploring, thinking about AI since the beginning, much before the emergence of ChatGPT? I mean, in hearing your background, it sounds like you probably AI been on your radar, I would imagine, well before it's been on mine. So I mean, I'd love to just hear more of the background of this story here.
Yeah, so EdSafe AI was actually founded in 2000,
Mm,
and it was founded by a group of folks in education that included industry and nonprofit organizations and some school districts. And it was really before the consumer breakthrough of ChatGPT that brought generative AI, I think, front and center to so many folks in our space. And because AI was starting to emerge in education prior to generative AI and chat GPT, we were starting to see things particularly around synthesis AI and data visualizations. And so there was this question around how as a sector could we actually do things differently. And so originally the alliance was led by Dexterra Institute and RID Labs. They founded it together with a group of us. And then this spring and summer, it became really clear that there was so much more um, interest in this work, and that it really needed an organization like InnovateEDU who had been involved since its founding to sort of take it on and be able to scale up so many of the great programs and work that was started by that core group of folks. And so it's a real privilege, frankly, to steward it into this next phase of growth. And I'm excited that we've already been able to do so much with the SAFE framework in policy circles. That's a framework that really helps folks think about policy making around generative AI and frankly, all types of AI in education. It helps people think through safety, that's the S, accountability, that's the A, fairness and transparency, and efficacy of AI applications in education. And so, whether that's the Software Industry Association's principles, and SAFE is a part of those, whether that's the Australian government's framework for generative AI, you'll see accountability, transparency, fairness, and safety as core pillars. Senator Schumer's framework for AI is named SAFE. He added an I on the end for innovation. And so, really, it's a way to think through the policymaking process that we think is so important when thinking about the use of AI in education. And we're starting to apply this already, frankly, in districts. So, along with 12 districts across the country, including New York City Public Schools, the largest district in the country. We've launched policy labs where districts are taking on problems of practice at the intersection of AI and education and working to develop open science policies that they will use for the sector. They are building the 80% common here to give folks some starter dough around everything from acceptable use to family engagement to privacy and security policies that we think are really important. Some are taking on issues like how can you make good choices around AI tools for the classroom? How do you build AI literacy with students, teachers, and families, even? And so, what's the role that education can play in our society, frankly, in helping take on a transformative technology? And so I'm really excited about the policy labs. Yesterday, I was in New York with actually our student policy lab, where with kids 13 to 16, where we have affirmative parental consent, they are learning about AI, doing some prompt engineering. And yesterday they presented to the deputy chancellor and members of the cabinet, as well as superintendents, their ideas where New York City should start when it comes to AI policy. And so these rapid feedback loops to get us to not have education be lagging adoption, but leading adoption, leading literacy conversations is something I'm really excited about in the work that we're doing at EdSafe AI.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds amazing. It sounds like there's so many stories and just perspectives there to really be learning from. I'm curious to dig in just a little bit more because I mean, the work just sounds fascinating to me, and I'm wondering, I'm hearing you say that the theory of change, if you will, or the way that they're exploring adoption and implementation is through the SAFE framework. I'm wondering if you could maybe voice over a little bit more, like what the steps or the process or the theory of change for doing so looks like, because in hearing that some schools are in a space where they're thinking, sounds like really broadly about specific issues in their school, like I think I heard you say like parent engagement
Mm-hmm.
or literacy, and then hearing the very micro of like students doing this specific experience. What generally are you, what's the lens that you are encouraging schools to think about as they engage and enter this type of experience? Is it about foundationally saying, regardless of AI, let's actually think about what your school looks like fundamentally and what's going to be best there, and then bringing that in? Is it more about trying to really lean into the SAFE framework and thinking about it from that? I'm curious, yeah, if you could just say more maybe about
Yeah.
the theory of change here and what that looks like.
Well, I think AI can be really overwhelming for folks who don't know or feel like they know about the technology. So, first, I think at EdSafe, we believe in building knowledge, not fear of the technology. And so, how you do that is giving people ways to encounter AI in a safe and ethical environment. And so, I would say we think about working through a policy lens that starts with safety, because when you think about what's happening right now in AI use in our country, folks aren't clear about what the guidelines and the guardrails are for the safe use of AI in education. And so we want folks to start from sort of the table stakes. And there's a reason the framework is architected with safety first, because we think that we have a fundamental duty of care to students and educators around their personal information and being really clear about what the guidelines and guardrails are. And right now, the guidelines and guardrails, and maybe it's the first time your listeners are going to hear this, are actually pretty clear from a legal perspective, and actually from what ChatGPT or Bard or any of the large language models are saying in their own acceptable use policies, that students who are under the age of 13 should not be using consumer generative AI tools in the classroom, and that students who are over 13 should only be using them with affirmative parental consent. And that might not consider what might happen in some states where that's a question of whether parents can give affirmative parental consent for these types of tools. And so, to your educators out there, Right now, student use of these tools in the classroom, for me, is a big red light on the safety
Hmm.
stoplight. Because right now, if you use those tools in your classroom, you're likely breaking the acceptable use policies of the tools themselves and likely the acceptable use policy of your own district. And so I just want to be really clear with educators. I sort of say it like it is, that as excited as we are to use these tools and as excited as young people are to use these tools, even through Snapchat filters, for example, we have a real duty of care right now to use these tools in a safe way. And so we think being clear about what those guidelines and guardrails are and that guidance is among the most important things that we can do right now. The
Yeah. No, that resonates. I'm sorry if I could just jump
Yeah,
in
yeah,
quickly
yeah.
here. I was also going to say, I know from like a macro school perspective, there's going to be very few schools at this given point in time that have actually developed data sharing agreements or have like FERPAs or anything like that in place with some of these like large AI tools. Just as a quick sub question though, I'd be curious to ask you this in case you might know. I know that we have been alluding to some of these bigger tools in this conversation, like a Chat GPT or Bard, and how those policies apply to them. I'm curious though how that translates to some of these like one-off products that are using like Chat GPT, like APIs or things I'm thinking of something like a Conmigo,
Hmm.
right? Where it's like an AI, it clearly is like using AI to do a tutoring thing. Now I'm not, I don't know everything about Conmigo. I'm just using it as an example. There's probably other tools, but for those types of tools that are for students less than the age of 13, how are they able to position themselves as being a tool in the classroom that is student facing, that maybe like have AI capabilities without being like the full on Chat GPT? I don't know if you have any context on that
Yeah,
there.
I'm not a lawyer. So I'll say that first. I'm a technologist. I think schools should be asking those questions
Mm,
and interrogating tools about how they're using large language model APIs, if the data is being used in training models, what are the enterprise agreements? Does that tool have an enterprise agreement with those large language models? Because enterprise agreements are different for those APIs than they are for sort of a a user agreement. And so there's a set of questions I think that schools need to be, I'm going to use the word interrogating here because I do think it's that serious. I do think
yeah.
we need to interrogate the tech we're using in our schools to make sure that it is safe and to make sure that the ways that teachers are using these tools to be in line with the acceptable use policy of the tool. And I say that also sitting from a former sort of school administrator, seat, that we had cyber insurance at our school. And one of the conditions of our cyber insurance was, did we follow the tool's acceptable use policies? What acceptable use policy is that referring to when it's a large language model? Having clarity about that is really, really important. And so I think there are there's work for the ed tech industry to do, and part of that is the SIA principles, and part of that is, even using the SAFE framework to look at their tool. And part of that is work that schools need to do to be in conversation with partners like Conmigo or others. And without naming other tools, I'm deeply familiar with a lot of ed tech tools in the market, and I get to be in conversations with lots of industry partners and players. And I think one of the things that I would say is there are some industry players right now who have some great AI tools out there that they are not putting out in the market because they can't red team or test those tools for bias. And that's actually something at EdSafe we're really focused on from a policy perspective, is in other sectors like healthcare or energy, there are large scale public data sets that developers can use to check if their outputs have bias in them, to see if they're, when they're doing this work, if the output of their tool or the predictive models they're using has bias in those models. We don't have that type of infrastructure and tooling in K-12 education. We haven't made those investments, and we need to. And that's part of the work that EdSafe is doing, is really advocating for and naming the need for that type of public good infrastructure to exist within education, so that companies like Renaissance Learning or Cognigo would have the ability to make some voluntary commitments, at least like other consumer tools have done right now, to say, like, yeah, we're testing and we're red teaming and we're eliminating bias. But I think even Sal Khan and Kristen over at Cognigo would say that Cognigo isn't perfect, and they're constantly working to figure it out. And I think they would also agree that even with a personalized tutor like Cognigo, a human always has to be in the loop.
Yeah. Yeah, it's I mean, I think what I'm just taking away from what you're saying is it's a very tricky landscape right now, and taking time to really pause and, as you said, really think through some of these back end pieces, using the framework that you all have to think about what's going to be best for your school district. Like there's probably so much value in just like really going slow
Yeah.
there to like make sure you are thinking being thoughtful about your plan before really launching into what we want to adopt, using now these 5 or 6 AI tools that seem great, and they, we think we can see how they're going to create a lot of impact. Okay, impact, but at what cost, right? Or at what, and breaching what
Yeah, and
policies.
I think there's some green use cases. So let's talk about those, because I think, we were talking
Yeah.
about some of those before we hit record, which is, the ability to make the invisible visible. So how do you chew the college catalogs of your, community colleges and your four-year institutions, and load those into a generative AI tool and understand what are the available computer science classes for a young person, or a dual enrollment opportunity. Like, there is so much green in the productivity and the efficiency that we could do right now that is not student facing, that those are the use cases that I would love us to run at. Things like, how in the midst of bus shortages could we use AI to recalculate bus routes and traffic patterns so that we are
Hmm.
changing and making more efficient bus routes for our bus drivers? How can we think about, again, the way that we take information that has often been siloed in education, and be more able to unlock that information from an equity perspective? So many opportunities in our system are coded knowledge in education, whether that's how to appeal financial aid, like you were talking about, Daniel, or whether that's, how do I get a great internship, or what internships are available to me when I'm in high school. AI can help us make that invisible visible right now. And for me, that's so exciting, and just has just sort of unlimited potential. And then I think schools can begin to create some safe spaces for teachers to build knowledge, not fear, of these tools, that where they're laying out what the guidelines and guardrails are, and creating playgrounds like we used to do with personalized learning tools or other types of things, where, think about taking your professional development day and having teachers get to get on ChatGPT for the first time, or use a tool like PlayLab AI, or some of these tools that allow safe spaces for teachers to build their own tools, or begin to play with AI that's not student facing. Those are things that districts can do right now while they're thinking about how we turn some of those yellow use cases green, and take some of those red use cases and get them into a place where we're clear about what the guidelines and guardrails are.
Yeah, and I mean, to your point, that in of itself is already a game changer for folks who have any type of experience in education, right? You ask a teacher or a school counselor or a school leader today, like, hey, if I could, if I could in a 60-minute presentation show you how you could potentially save 10 hours a week, like when you're very proficient, like, would you be interested in that? I can't think of a teacher or school.
Yeah,
school counselor or school leader that would say no to that. Like, absolutely. You mean I won't have to work 60 hours a week? I can work like 40, like a regular
yeah,
person. Yeah, I could. We could show you how using some tools in very low lift weights today. And then, as you said, the exciting part there is they're also going to think about some really exciting use cases to start to create efficiencies and optimizations within their own workflows as they start to better understand how the tools work. I continue to hear so many misconceptions, even in my own networks. And I'm kind of like the AI guy among my friends, which is kind of funny. And I've even talked to a couple of folks, and they're like, "You mean you don't have to code to use AI tools?" No, that's the whole reason I love them so much, right? You don't have to know Java or any of these things. You just have to know words, and you know what teachers are masters at?
yeah.
Communicating. That's what. And so you all are going to have a strategic advantage once you start to understand how these tools work because you're giving explicit instructions all day long.
That's right. Like you have the natural competency and disposition to be a great prompt engineer, right? Because
Hmm.
how many times as a teacher, I used to do this, or I still do this in meetings where I find myself being like, ooh, that was like I narrate, that was a really poor way. I just gave
Yep.
instructions. Too many steps, too complicated. First, do this. Second, do this. Third, do this. And so I think that you're right that teachers can be creators here, not just consumers. And if we think about that as the paradigm that we're walking into, that we can be in the driver's seat in education, we can be building AI literacy right now with our students, right now with our families, right now with our educators, then it's not going to be the same mistakes, frankly, we've made in the past with education technology in our school systems. Technology is never going to replace a great teacher. Let's just be honest. A great teacher is
Hmm.
always going to be the game changer for a student, but it can give that teacher more time to focus on the thing that makes a great teacher, which is building the relationship with a young person and getting to know them and making sure that they're safe, known, and loved.
I want to go back to something
Yeah.
earlier you said that is just really calling to me at this moment because it's been so much of my recent conversations with folks, which is just about the role of our students and our young people in these
Mm.
conversations. And I think what I'm also recognizing is that there's potentially a little bit of a tension that exists here with that because on the one hand, it is so vital that our young people get to play a really pivotal role in helping to co-create their educational experience, right? As we're navigating this increasingly complex world here. But then legally, privacy wise, there are some instances where it may be difficult to allow them to see or have access or to play around with some of these things in the same way that adults can, given some of these privacy things. So how do we reconcile with both of those things? How do we give them a very prominent seat at the table and really like listen and help them drive potential policies or the potential experience and how that shapes, knowing that when you think about accessibility of tools for that cohort of stakeholders relative to adults is going to look a little bit different. I'm wondering what your learnings have been there.
Yeah, I'm going to pull from some brilliant kids I met yesterday. Jada from Brooklyn, who told me the thing that she loves about school right now is she has a vet class where she gets to like work with animals. And sure, there's some, she called it paperwork. She's talking about worksheets. Sure, there's some paperwork. That's what she called it. I loved it. Like, that's paperwork. That's
That's paperwork, all
paperwork.
right.
She
Yeah.
has some paperwork, but like really what makes that her favorite class right now is that she's able to gain that experience. Overwhelmingly yesterday, what I heard from young people was we need help to understand what these tools look like. And so I really go back to this idea of literacy. Like, how do we help? Because we can build literacy around what is AI for kids who are in kindergarten without them having to access the tools. Them understanding
Hmm.
what is AI is the first step, right? That it's again that like knowledge, not fear. And so, I think this is just a critical part of where education can lead. That on April 19th, along with Common Sense Media, EDSAFE, AI AI for Education, and the Tech Interactive, we're hosting National AI Literacy Day. And we're going to have
Hmm.
lesson plans, curriculum, professional learning opportunities that are synchronous and asynchronous, local affiliate events and national events that help build in education capacity for folks to answer this question in classrooms and communities around the country. What is AI? And if we can do that and do that together on April 19th, we're beginning that journey to putting students and families and communities at the center. Because what we're doing is we're building this knowledge. We're saying, like, we're not saying these tools are good. We're not saying these tools are bad. We're saying, like, understand what these tools are. Then we can have other conversations. But if you don't have a baseline understanding around what is AI, that's a challenge right now. And Daniel, I maybe it's because I work in policy. I look at polling pretty frequently, and we work with a couple firms who give us polling that they do, national polling. And one of the things that came back to us in January that made my heart sink a little bit is some polling from Morning Consult that was about knowledge and use of AI. And I shouldn't have been surprised by this. It shouldn't have made my heart sad, but it did, because the historical gaps that we've seen in education are repeating themselves right now around knowledge and use of AI. The highest cohort of folks who have knowledge and use, white, male, college educated folks. Lowest, women, rural communities, urban communities. That does not have to be the case. We can turn that tide around, but if we continue on the path we're on right now, without us finding that 80% common, without us coming together to do things differently, without us breaking down those silos, we're going to repeat these patterns in education, which have meant that ed tech is not equitable right now. There are digital use, digital access, and digital design divides. They proliferate this country. I think that we could do something differently. That's why I'm working as hard as I am with these districts and with this like amazing alliance of organizations to say we're going to row together and we're going to do things differently. But I want to warn people, we're on a path right now that we have to be committed to doing something different. Or we're going to just look back in 12 months, 18 months, 2 years, 5 years, and say, gosh, we missed this opportunity to transform education into a learning system where we really do put students, communities, and educators in the driver's seat.
Ooh, it's hard for me to ask it. I feel like I need to just sit in your words for a little bit. I'm, there, but yeah, I mean, so much of that resonates, and I just appreciate you for sharing that. And yeah, I think we'll have to connect too, and as you all have details about how school districts and schools can participate on an AI day, I'd love to be
Yeah,
able to
we love
continue to
you.
share
Yeah.
those, here in this space, because everything you said resonates, and I think that's the reason I'm also trying to continue to make sure I'm continuing this conversation, is because I don't want that to be the case. Also, I don't want private, highly affluent high schools to be the only ones that have AI literacy and proficiency, and then the rest of us don't. And that's not what I want for our country either.
Me
So
neither.
yeah, just appreciate you for naming
Me neither. And
that.
folks can go to AILiteracyDay.org and sign up for updates right now. So if folks go to AILiteracyDay.org, you can subscribe for updates, and you'll see us start asking for folks to sign up to do local events. Curriculum will be posted in March, so folks can begin to do some of that planning, and it'll be bite sized, right? It'll be able for a teacher who's in a class to take 30 minutes and just lead a lesson on what is AI, get a little bit into ethics, not into like skills or anything like that, but just really help students and families be able to answer that question on April 19th.
No, that sounds great. Thanks, Aaron, for sharing so much just about that, and definitely looking forward to being more involved in that as that comes. Wanted to just ask a couple of
Sure.
other questions just related to EdSafe before we really close out here. I think something else beyond just the role of our students, and some of the pieces you've also mentioned, has just been the role of, well, two things. I think the first is just around like AI policy. I know that folks, there's definitely been a dialogue that I've heard around the need for policy around like that being something that schools should really prioritize in some of their initial steps, and really thinking about this thoughtfully. And I know that you all were recently working with like really massive school districts, such as like New York City Public Schools, and doing it, and I had the opportunity to work in Houston ISD for a decade. And I think one of my biggest just takeaways from that experience was to create policies for school districts of that size is just so tough because of so many of the different facets, layers, experiences, considerations that go into that. I was wondering if you could just maybe share a little bit more of like some of the process, the considerations, things that you're holding when you're thinking about what an AI policy has to look like for some of these, large urban hubs that are throughout our country. We have a lot of them throughout our country, and as they're thinking about what those policies have to look like or how to go about thinking about it in the right
Yeah,
way.
I mean, I talked a little bit about how InnovateEDU builds tables. In New York, we built a table that I think is really unique because it has engagement from every division within New York City public schools. So we have a core advisory group that brings together cabinet level and senior leaders, and then we have policy teams that are working in these different threads. And the first document we're actually going to release, and we've decided to accelerate sort of the release of this document. We were going to release stuff all together in June. We're going to release this process document, which I think is super sexy, about how we've built these teams and how we're doing these threads, and even how we're going to openly survey and create opportunities for educators and families and students in New York to give voice to the things that they're thinking about in their use and their fears and where they are in terms of knowledge. We're gonna publish this process document relatively soon so that other school districts could pick it up and begin to get started and think about organizing the people, building knowledge, and then how you actually create feedback loops within your districts to be able to co-construct policy. We're not going to get it all right in New York in the first go, but I think that's one of the things that's really unique about the policy labs and the approach that we're taking in all of our districts, whether that's Santa Ana or El Segundo or New York City, is this commitment to openness, this commitment to community, this commitment to capacity building. Like, so brave of the chancellor to say, we're going to share what we got as we're building it, because we know that there's districts across the country who, frankly, from an equity perspective, don't have the resources of New York City. And so how can we help them get started? How can we begin to build a community? We talked about like the loneliness of leadership. It's so much leadership to be vulnerable here and to say, like, we're going to put out our process document, we're going to put out our version 1 of our policies. We're going to make them open science so you can see what we're doing. You can take them as Creative Commons. You can use them as starter Joe. It's, you know, it's not easy, but it's also not so different from the way we build alliances across other parts of the ecosystem. We've built a table. We're building avenues for trust and capacity building. We're building knowledge, and then we roll up our sleeves and we work together in the same room, thinking about what we want to accomplish. And I think in New York, the North Star goals of the chancellor are really guiding this work, and his leadership, along with Deputy Chancellor Quintana, have said what we do has to live our values, has to speak to our values, has to demonstrate inclusivity and equity. And like, there's probably a lot of people talk about those things. I will tell you, I am watching that district walk the walk. The very first inputs that senior leadership heard were yesterday's students talking about what they needed. That is unbelievable. Not an expert, not, but
Yeah, it's
it was
fantastic.
students saying, I need this. You have to be clear with teachers about how they give instructions to students. You have to tell teachers if AI checkers are inbounds or out of bounds. You have to tell me how I appeal if a teacher accuses me of using AI and I
Mm,
didn't. A young
hmm
person even said to me, like, you have to educate my dad. He's an immigrant and he thinks whenever I'm using the internet that I'm cheating. I was so moved yesterday by the depth of leadership that was demonstrated. not by talking, but by listening.
Yeah, I mean that's great, and I know, Erin, we're getting close to time here, so let me ask you just like two quick tactical questions as we close out here. I mean, I think the first is just as someone who is so deeply ingrained in the AI education world here. I mean, what's one of your favorite personal AI use cases? One way that you find yourself using AI, and then just lastly, in addition to AI Day, just any other ways that you would invite folks to connect with you to learn more about your work or to connect with
Yeah,
you.
so I'm going to talk about my use of AI for productivity. So I use a app, not endorsing, but I use an app called Read AI, and it goes into all of my Zoom meetings where I have consent of everyone to record. And it's great because it gives me meeting notes and all those things, but there's things about me as a leader that I'm constantly working on. And that's, like how much talk time I take, what's the tone and tenor of the
Mm,
meeting, especially when I give feedback. And I've trained this AI. So that's the other thing I want to tell your listeners. I've been using it for now about 2 years. So I've really trained it, but I'm able to set it so every meeting it gives me a score to me about my behavior in the meeting, and did I allow for equal voice, and did I start with the relational rather than just the tactical things that, like, as a leader I'm working on, and that frankly just make me a better human. So I love Read AI. It's one of my favorite. And then I will confess that with my son, who's 8, we just had to build a diorama cereal box of Harry Potter's Goblet of Fire. And I used
mm.
Dale to make Harry Potter's Lucky Charms, which is our cereal, and build the front cover of the cereal box. And so
Yeah.
that was super
Mhm.
fun. And his classmates were sort of like, oh my God, that's so cool. So again, like that's about us, like with guidelines and guardrails and me right next to him being a creator, not just a consumer of AI. And so that's what I want to see us all doing. So those are my two favorites: Harry Potter, Lucky Charms, Read AI.
That's so much fun. I can't wait till my little guy gets bigger. I'm gonna do something like that.
It's
That
super
sounds
fun.
really
It was
fun.
really fun.
So, I mean, just to close out here, any other notes you'd throw out there around just if folks who want to learn more about Innovate EDU, connect with you, what beyond AI Day, and some of the resources I'll share in future episodes. Like how else would you invite them to connect
Yeah,
with
I
you?
mean, I think, we're here to support this sector right now with lots of resources. And so we have a fellowship that opens up every November. We just selected our fellows for 2024, but 2024, 2025, but we have like a really amazing fellowship that folks should follow. We'll be publishing all the work of the policy labs, and folks should just feel free to reach out. We are supported by philanthropy at EDSAFE AI, and our job is to really build the capacity of the sector to be able to be the leader here, not the lagger. And so, I think me or Dr. Jordan Morozak, who runs the EdSafe AI Alliance with me, is always happy to jump on the phone and engage and build knowledge, not fear, of this great technology.
Awesome, Erin. Thank you so
Thank you,
much for your
Daniel. I
time
just
today.
want to say thank you because I think we need folks out there who are having honest conversations about this technology and seeing its promise, but also its perils. And so I really appreciate the work that you're doing and your long service as an educator. You are not alone. Thanks for building community.